Hey, everybody, this is Ben Bowman. Welcome to another episode of the Oregon Bridge.
I really think that Oregonians need somebody who takes that leadership role of bringing people together around the big issues rather than having the big issues be things that divide them. I think that the governor has a responsibility to actually go and listen to people in their communities, like in their place, in an accessible and transparent manner. And so I feel like there's these connections that we really should be making that are based upon the inherent differences in our communities.
All right, everybody. On today's episode, we have our first Democratic candidate for Oregon governor, Casey Kulla. Casey is a Yamhill County Commissioner. Yamhill County is a mostly rural county in Northwest Oregon. It includes McMinnville and Newburgh. It's also the home county of New York Times columnist Nick Kristof, and potential Democratic candidate for governor as well. And Casey's got a really interesting backstory. He's only served on the commission for 2 years. And his background, he has training as a biochemist and a forest ecologist. He was a marijuana grower for a while. And so he's got a unique perspective to bring to the table. We asked him a lot in this episode. We covered a lot of ground. I'll give you a brief overview of things to look for. The obvious question, why are you running for governor, for someone who relatively new to elected office and doesn't serve in the state legislature? As he's noted, traditionally, most governors started their time in politics in the state legislature. An interesting conversation in this episode is about the Yamhill County Trail. Which sounds like a very wonky local government, who cares sort of issue. But the answer to the question, who cares, is actually a lot of people in Yamhill County. It's been a very divisive topic locally. And so we talk about this trail, and there's an article written about it that basically says, what's happening in Yamhill County with regards to this trail as a microcosm of our larger political and social context. So that's an interesting conversation. His perspective is really interesting. That's where we first mentioned Nick Kristof in conversation, because some folks have sort of indicated that either Nick should not run and support Casey, or Casey should not run and support Nick. So we talk a little bit about that. We spent some time on the urban-rural divide. Alex isn't able to join for the intro, but he's in the episode. And one of the things he wanted me to note in the intro is that Casey does reject the label of rural Democrat. He says he doesn't like to use labels. And in Titus's mind, that is one of his advantages, is that he's a rural Democrat. So Titus believes he should embrace the label. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I think we just don't know the field. We don't know the issues that are going to be most pertinent when the election draws near. So who knows? But more to come on that front for sure. We also talk about the timber industry and, what Democrats and what, Oregon government more broadly can offer to timber dependent economies that haven't really replaced the timber industry when it vacated over the last 20 or 30 years, or I guess 30 to 40 years probably. We have a conversation about viability and then racial justice as well, where he said something that was interesting to me that I didn't know about in terms of groups. He calls them racial equity groups and queer communities who are unhappy with the current with the governor and the leadership in the legislature addressing all their needs. So look for that comment near the end. But we'll keep it pretty short today. I hope you all enjoy this episode. One other plug before you go. If you haven't heard yet, the Oregon Bridge has joined forces with the Oregon Way, and we're creating something new and something special. The best way you can support the work that we're doing on this podcast and the work that we're doing on the Oregon Way is by becoming a paid subscriber to the Oregon Way. So it's theoregonway.substack.com. Very easy to find. Put in your email address. You can choose one of the tiers of subscription that you'd like, and that'd be a big help for us. It will help us do some more cool stuff as we move into the future. But with that, let's dive into the episode. Thanks again to our producer, Buddy Terry, for making this all possible, and we hope you enjoy the episode. All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Oregon Bridge. And today we are excited to be joined by Yamhill County Commissioner Casey Kulla. Casey, thanks for joining the podcast.
Awesome to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So let's start with the obvious question here. How does, at the time, a cannabis farmer and scientist end up running for their county commission against an incumbent? What's the story of how you got pulled into politics?
I mean, there's so many versions, right? The short one is that I got really mad. Well, my wife got really mad about a very poor land use decision that she was at, and I was at home on the farm, and she was with the kids, and she texted me, and she was like, "Oh my God, can you believe they did this?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm running." Um, but the longer version is, my wife and I, no longer doing this, but my wife and I were the leaders in opposing a gravel quarry that was set up just upstream from our farm on our Grand Island. So it's a river island in the Willamette. And if you don't know land use is like the best way to do community organizing and engage in. It's like the best way to get into the Oregon process of politics. And so we fought that, got people together around it, disparate views. Let me tell you, if we're talking about disparate views, we were the bridge getting all these folks together. And so out of that, when we lost repeatedly, my cynicism grew. It felt like the system was rigged against people who were opposing land use decisions. And what I gradually learned, the nuance of that is that, of course, land use and planning and development is all about somebody bringing an application and looking at the laws and saying, how do I fit this into the laws? The laws plus the evidence is what you get your decision out of. So it really is, in a way, it is rigged, because the goal is to get to yes in the land use system from the planning side. And so I developed a cynicism about it. And then one day I was like, instead of cynicism, I can actually be engaged in that process. I can actually make these decisions, and bringing that, especially the science background. I wanted to have our decision makers fully engaged in our decisions, having read everything, considered both sides, considered the rules and the laws, and figured out where they had discretion too. Because the balance of discretion and rules-based order is the really fascinating thing to me, because there's tension in there. Probably like Alex and Ben here, there's some tension, and you don't know how to fit it, but you got to accept that it's just there.
Little healthy tension for sure.
Yeah.
No, little healthy tension is always good for sure. Well, so Casey, so you've been a commissioner for 2 years. And of course, kind of as you just said, you don't really have extensive experience in state level government, policy, politics, all that fun stuff. And you're currently the front runner right now of the Democratic field.
This is true.
So,
my neighbor Nick Kristof isn't the front runner. That's good to know.
Nick Kristof hasn't jumped in yet. So right now, if the primary were held today, Casey Kulla would win with unanimous support of Democrats in Oregon.
It'd be 100-0.
So exciting. But Alex, I think you were leading somewhere.
Yeah. So what made you pull the decision to want to run for governor, right? I mean, some of the people that are looking in the race right now, obviously you have Speaker Kotek, you have commissioners from Portland, maybe the mayor of Portland, which I know we've talked about on this show a couple of times, which, a New York Times columnist who's quite kind of a famous global celebrity. What made you, County Commissioner of Yamhill, want to run for governor?
Totally. So the real high level stuff is that I feel like on our state, the one thing we really need is leadership that brings us together, kind of acting as that bridge that we've got going on here, where I kind of feel like I'm hanging out between Ben and Alex. I really think that Oregonians need to have somebody who takes that leadership role of bringing people together around the big issues, rather than having the big issues be things that divide them. And that's what I do, we started our farm 15 years ago, full-time, year-round vegetable farm. And the two driving principles were building community and growing abundantly. And that's I feel like that in a nutshell is what we need in the leadership in state government in Oregon. And so the legislature, for example, is really different than the state executive leadership position. Legislators tend to do what they know best, right? Which is to legislate. So when I come to a legislator, and so we've been doing land use policy and advocacy and cannabis policy and advocacy kind of all along in there. And when we would go to a legislator, we would say, hey, this is a problem. And they'd say, which statute can I fix? Or what language can I add to a statute? So that's their like the universe of solutions. For me, especially as a county commissioner and as a farmer, the universe of solutions is the universe. So we can make things happen at the smallest scale. Like timber unity in rural communities and the mutual aid like the blocks in inner Portland can both be solutions at one scale, building up to county and city and beyond to state and federal level. So being a county commissioner, we're working with everybody all the time because we have to. So bringing that into the state level leadership is what I think I bring. And I'm not scared.
Yeah, no, and that's interesting. And I want to ask you a similar question, actually, that we asked to Jamie McLeod-Skinner. If you listen to our podcast, Jamie obviously ran for Congress against Greg Walden. She's a rural Democrat. She's also a progressive. I imagine you kind of frame yourself in the same light.
Wait. He's saying no.
Oh, he's shaking his head. Okay, yeah. No.
I want to hear more about the discrepancy.
Yeah, no, but Alex he needed to finish his question. Should I like go into it and then he finishes his question?
Yeah.
I'll just say, Alex, that yeah. So I don't see myself as a rural Democrat, and honestly, my values are very, very progressive. I mean, you can go to my website and look at like how I list and like how I make decisions, but I don't see myself as a rural Democrat or an urban Democrat or a farmer Democrat or a pot farmer Democrat. I see myself as part of this group of people who actually think that government has a role to play in making people's lives better and in evening out the playing field, doing things that individuals on their own can't do well. And I will say that in Oregon, we've seen time and again that state agencies sometimes really drop the ball. So I just want to acknowledge that the state agencies have a long ways to go in actually doing things well. And so that's why I say that I'm not a rural Democrat. And that's
okay,
just
we'll leave it to Jamie then and Senator Johnson. Actually, maybe Senator Gelser also. She was like, I'm kind of in the middle. I was like, all right, fair enough.
That's true.
And really for me, like I don't self-identify with really anything. I mean, I love being like, yo, I'm the pot farmer county commissioner, but that's really almost entirely in jest. I've spent my life floating between circles, and I think maybe the best way to describe it is that when I was in college, I was at Western Washington University in Bellingham, and I have a biochemistry degree as my initial. And so I was working in biochemistry labs. I was, walking the red square, they call it. But at the same time, I was also working part-time for the plumbing shop at the university, Union Plumbing Shop. I was a plumber's assistant. And so there were days when I would be walking across Red Square, like carrying my backpack and just being a student. And then literally later that day, I was working on the steam fittings underneath Red Square.
Wow.
And so I feel like that's really exemplified my life, is that I've had the opportunity of living in totally different worlds at the same time. So that was totally an aside for you, Alex.
No, I think that's actually a good lead into our question, which is we have to talk about the trail. This is a big issue in Yamhill County. My uncle actually lives in Yamhill County. My family's from out there. And I thought this was like super bizarre when I first read about it. There's a wonderful article in I believe it's called the High Country News. It's by Leah Sawtile. The article is titled "How a Trail in Rural Oregon Became a Target of Far-Right Extremism." And so, Casey, I'm going to give a summary of my understanding based on that article. And then we've got some questions to help us understand what are the implications of this for a statewide audience, which is who we're talking to. So on the Yamhill County Commission, you've got a Democrat, and then you've got Mary Starrett, who is, I will editorialize and say, very conservative. She was a Constitution Party nominee for governor in Oregon back in the day. I believe her husband is very involved in the Oregon Firearms Federation, which is obviously a Second Amendment group that I think is often considered further to the right than the NRA in Oregon. And then say it again.
It's her brother.
Oh, it's her brother. Her brother.
I just want to
No, that's helpful.
Go ahead.
And then you've got Lindsay Bershauer, who is a Republican as well, and sort of like a campaign operative. I believe she's got experience running campaigns and helping Republicans win elections. this was a shift in the county governance system. Like, it used to be sort of like maybe people who were more conservative, but the issues were more apolitical. Like, it wasn't a super partisan environment. And so basically previous county commissions and county and non-elected county leadership had been moving forward with this trail idea, which seems like a great idea. It's like basically a trail through Yamhill County that would bring people, pedestrians, bicyclists, etc., like this scenic trail. But it became a wedge issue. It became like a partisan wedge issue where these conservative county commissioners, sort of in partnership with some farmers who owned land, whose land would be affected in their view by the trail, who like turned this into super partisan. And so the basic fallout from this article is like, they voted, it was 2-1, you were in the minority, and they voted to stop moving forward with this trail, which has significant financial implications for the county because you've got grants and you've unlocked some funding to construct this, and then now it's been stopped. So the premise of this article is like, that story is indicative of larger political patterns across the state. So before we get into our questions, did I leave anything important out of that summary, or did I capture it about correctly?
I think you did it. Yeah.
So
yeah, no complaint. I mean, there's so much nuance in everything, but go ahead.
Okay. No. Yeah, for sure. And maybe that will come out here because, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I was reading your Twitter. And one of the things, so Nick Kristof, New York Times columnist, who is floating this idea of potentially running for governor, someone tagged you, I think it was Rob Harris, tagged you and said, Nick Kristof should support Casey Kulla in his campaign. They're both Yamhill County Democrats, and they sort of have this similar appeal. And your argument was essentially like, vision and leadership are important. I'm actually doing it right now. So tell me, but my initial response was like, but Casey got railroaded on this trail. Like, and I'm on your side on it.
Right.
Like, but you like the partisan environment seems to sort of like overcome your approach, which is like super collaborative, bring people together for discussions. It seems like the other side doesn't want to have that approach and they just want to do what they want to do. So how do you see it? Do you see it differently than I do?
Such a great question, Ben. Yes. So because elected officials have to have like hokey sayings, but mine are usually a little bit longer. How I have a hokey saying is that in Oregon, we can do anything with some time, some money, and some willing participants, but the last one is the hardest to find, right?
I love that.
It's going to be a very long campaign bumper sticker.
Yeah. I know. And we have ones that are trees are the answer too. So
that's good.
But you're right that it's the approach that requires willing participants requires that willing participants show up at the table. And so this is, if you've read in my campaign policy kind of position statements, one of them is around a relook at an update to the 50-year-old land use system that we have. And one of the things in there, like I would say, and based upon talking to Senator or Governor Kulangowski about this, I would say that I'm wagering that I'm the most experienced in land use of anybody who's likely to run for governor on both sides. So I spoke to 1,000 Friends of Oregon the other day to their board because I'm in their Farmer Advisory Council, and I regularly on the other side of things from them. And I went through some of the ways to look at the world and how we can make land use really relevant to the major challenges we have. And I would say that one of the big challenges, specifically with Rails to Trails projects, is that in Oregon land use, if you're on exclusive farm use zoning, you can't put recreational facilities there except through the conditional use permit process. And as hopefully both of you know, just like the court system, land use is, once it gets to the level of public hearings before decision-making bodies, it's inherently an adversarial relationship. So that means that I can't, outside of a public hearing, I can't talk to Ben Van Dyke. So Ben Van Dyke, for example, is a farmer who is my age, similar age children. We have different color tractors, but we can get over that. I'll just say that mine are blue and his are green. But there's no ability inside of the land use system to really dig in and figure out what things do we agree on and what things do we have that are no-goes. And so what I do all the time is I build relationships with the goal of someday us needing to get along. So I build trust all the time. The problem with the land use system is that it takes those relationship building, and it doesn't allow them. It doesn't allow for a compromise in the moment. If we had, for example, set up a master plan advisory committee or an advisory committee in some capacity, and had development by right for a recreational facility on exclusive farm use zone land, we could have worked through all these problems all the way along, but inherently we had an adversarial system. So that's like the shortest possible version I can see for how this is different. But it also set itself up as, you were right, a wedge issue. Like the physical, if you like put a wedge in, you're going to split a piece of wood, and you tap that wedge in, and then you're like, here we go, and money pounded that wedge in. So I think one of the challenges in our land use system is that it is just like the political system and campaign system. It flows on money. So one thing I'd like to see is a conversation about whether we can actually have transparency in the financial dealings that are associated with land use. And I think that would be so fascinating, because right now we don't know at the county level who's paying the bills of the opposition.
Fascinating. And I like how you're using land use as a case study for the political system. So, and I also like the idea of willing participants and that being a critical part of this. Sure. My question is, like, my follow-up question to that, and I know Titus has an urban rural divide question, which is all kind of tied into this, but
yeah,
I think you could argue, probably Democrats would argue, that we're seeing an increase in unwilling participants in our politics. And I think the walkouts is the best example. Like, people basically being like, no, I'm not going to negotiate on your terms. If you're doing something that is moving in the direction I don't like, or I think is bad for my constituents, the lever I have is to leave and to not participate.
Right.
So
right.
what's your theory of action, or what's your case for how to cultivate more willing participants, or to create willing participants from people who feel threatened or maybe uninclined to kind of sit at the table with you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I think that, and hold your ears now, Alex. I think that
my ears are being held.
President, yeah, thank you. He just unmuted himself, or he muted himself. I think that President Biden had a really an astute observation that the people of the United States are ultimately our decision makers, even if in the temporary intermediate we've got folks that they've elected. And so, he was like, I'm going to go to people in the community because the things that I'm proposing are popular with them. I think likewise, it behooves governors and executives to remember that there are people in every one of these communities, that it's not just 60 people and 30 people that the governor needs to get on their side. I think that the governor has a responsibility and a call to actually go and listen to people in their communities, like in their place, in an accessible and transparent manner, because that's the only way. I would say that's the only way to actually hear what's happening, and to hear the fears of people in their communities, and to hear their hopes. So like, I went to Prineville recently, and I sat down with, it was like a mixed group, and I say mixed because it was intended to be Crook County Democrats, but some hardcore Republicans joined us, and it was such a delight to be pitching to Democrats specifically, but to have that, like, hey, remember, there's this person here who needs to be heard, who has a right to be heard in our democratic process. So I'm not just talking to them, I'm also listening to everybody here. So I think one is that the governor, in order to further priorities, needs to actually hear what the concerns are in communities, whether they're rural or they're urban. And I will say that in my travels, I hear a surprising number of the same things in rural and urban settings. So sorry, we're getting to your question, Alex, a little bit. But beyond that, it really is about building relationships with people, because you don't think you have the same things in common. I say that a good example of that is that I went up to Portland, I don't know, 2 years ago, and I was like, hey, Andrew Hone, who's I think he's the CEO of Portland Business Alliance. I asked him, I was like, you seem to work really well with city government, and I'm having a hard time at like finding a way to build relationships with our local chambers. And so he kind of laid out, he's like, here's what we do. We maintain constant communication. We're seeing that now that they do. But we push back when we have the chance, but we also recognize that we have the same priorities on things. And so I went to our local chambers and I was like, I'm going to be your friend, because you don't like me because I'm a Democrat, and you're like, I'm going to support the Republicans on everything. And it was like, that's not how it works, is that we work together to make our community better. So that's like the airy-fairy version of, I guess, that the governor, in my view, is more than a cheerleader and is more than just a policy setter and a priority setter, but they're also the comforter, and they're also the listener for the state. They're also the person who is like, damn, we can do this thing. How are we going to do it? Maybe the thing in your community looks different than the thing in our community.
Yeah. So Case, and even just to zone out a little bit before we get more back into the details. One thing that we talk about a lot on this podcast is the urban-rural divide. And usually, actually, I do all the work and have to define it. So I'm going to shoot this question to you, which is what I'm going to do going forward with our guests, is before we even talk about the policies or sort of the dynamics, what does the urban-rural divide look like in your mind?
So Alex, actually, if have you read the High Country News article?
Yes.
Okay, so I talk about it a little bit there, right? But to me, the urban and rural divide is really around the fact that we all often have the same problems in our communities, like homelessness in Lake County and homelessness in Inner Portland. They're both issues, but the solutions to them look different. And that, I think, is one of the crux of the problem that we might see at the legislature, is when the legislature tries to do something, it's often across the state the same thing, when typically, I say typically because everything has its nuance, typically the solutions should look different in each community, just based upon the values, if nothing else. But the cheeky version is that the difference between urban areas and rural areas is that in rural areas we live further apart. That's like, it's like overly simplistic to the nth degree. But like on the island that we live on right now, like I can't actually see any of our neighbors' homes, and I'm like sitting on like a little spot here. But we have like 3%ers members down the road, but we also have the former commissioner for natural resources for Alaska is the next house down, and then the next one is a 4th generation cherry grower on the island who now rents out some of his barns as wedding venues. And so I feel like we're spread out, and there may be some antisocial tendencies among rural folks compared to urban folks. Like, we live further apart for a reason, but it's also, there are some true physical differences in that out here in the country, we often produce things, whether we're exporting raw materials, or whether we're making wine and beer, or cheese, or producing grass seed. We're like sending things out into the world, and then conversely, urban areas are sending taxes our way. And so I feel like there's these connections that we really should be making that are based upon the inherent differences in our communities.
That's that's a very interesting point. Which would be way too nerdy if I dived into the intellectual side. But Michael Lind actually had a great piece on that rural communities export the important things like food, et cetera, and that some of those tax revenues do come back basically to support those communities. But I won't dive too much into that because it'll get really nerdy really quickly. But
I love it though. Yeah, thank you.
But I did want to flag one thing that you said a little bit earlier in your answer, and as part of that is the cultural issue. Because I think that the divide is, yes, it's economic in some sense. And I mean, some rural areas, especially in this part of the state, have just been absolutely decimated, especially when it comes to some of the timber communities. But I think part of it is cultural. too, right? In the sense of that,
Yeah.
and I will clarify here because someone will definitely be like, no, Alex, you said this wrong technically. But I remember when President Biden said basically something along the lines of, we're going to win the voters in Manhattan and we're also going to win the voters in Scranton. And I did look, and he did barely win Scranton. So I'm not going to say difference because someone will correct me, but I think you kind of get the general gist of what I'm saying, right? People in Prineville are very different than the people in Westland, Oregon, where I'm from. And I think part of it is cultural values, right? I mean, one sort of funny thing to me kind of growing up and seeing this divide is like, I feel like in my parents' original suburb, like the signs growing up were basically split like 40-60, right? It was like a lot of John Kerry signs, but there was a couple George Bush signs kind of scattered around there, you know, a little bit. But now it's basically like everybody has some sort of sign in our neighborhood that's like something about Black Lives Matter or like science is real or sort of like things like that. And then kind of more in the diverse rural areas, right? Like Democrats actually used to win about 45% of the vote in some of these areas. And that's slowly drifting to become dramatically more towards the GOP. And I personally think it's because of the cultural differences. And those are just playing such a bigger issue now in our society than maybe that they were before. But I'm sort of curious of you, who's a progressive in a rural area, like, you know, but you seem to be one, I think, at least from what you came off in the article, is like part of it is you're just respectful to people in general, which I think is something that's actually missed a lot in politics and something that I think has probably caused you to be, you know, successful, even though I think your views probably differ heavily than a lot of the constituents. But I'm just curious of like, what do you think of the cultural gap? And then what do you maybe think that are kind of some ways to bring that stuff together?
Yeah. So I would say that I might come across as respectful, but it's actually, it comes from a place that I really like people. Like, I just love people. And so maybe it's more like love than respect. And that sounds weird, but like, I can't help but love folks who just disagree with me profoundly. Now, there's some people that I wouldn't turn my back on in the dark, you know, or in a rural area, I guess, you know, not drive down their road in the dark. But I do think that there's a lot to be gained in the world by respecting people who we differ from culturally. And I don't think any of it's linear. I don't think it can't be transactional in my view. I don't think you can go into an area and be like, I respect you, and then expect to be welcomed. That's just like not how it works. So, and that's why I say the non-linearity of it. It's just like, I think that people have to put in the time in order to even understand what's happening in a community. But I do think that, no offense, Alex, I'm going to be, no offense, but I do think that cultural, the idea that there's cultural differences that make the places that are foundational to the urban rural divide. I actually don't think that that's true, except in the context of electoral politics. And the reason I say that is because some rural areas, some extremely rural areas, are deeply like high numbers. They're very diverse, but the electorate, the people who actually have the means and the time, the ability, the legal status to vote, have embraced their own cultural, you know, norms and distinctions and values. But in our rural areas, we have, so the island, you know, I talked about all these different people on the island, but about half of our island is career farm workers who primarily speak Spanish and aren't able to vote. And they are doing their work to promote their families and get them ahead and get their kids educated and speaking English. And, you know, the whole list of like American dream kind of stuff. And so I feel like there's more cultures in rural areas than sometimes the pictures are drawn of, but electoral politics seems to be more conservative these days.
Well,
I feel like you had another question in there too. But I do think that the beginning of I don't want to have any homogenization. I think that it's really powerful to have different people with different views, even if they're living in different places. What I do grow concerned about is the segregation of people by their culture and political views.
Right.
And that's a great deal of concern to me, which honestly is part of running, is that I don't want to see Greater Idaho happen.
Right.
Just straight up, I think that we need everybody in Oregon to be in Oregon and be committed to living here and making this a better place.
So that's
Sorry, Ben, you were going to say something.
No. I'm processing what you're saying, and also, so Titus mentioned the timber industry and the decline of the timber industry. And so it's interesting to hear you kind of push back a little bit on the cultural divide. But certainly there's an economic divide between urban and suburban Oregon and rural Oregon, and particularly in places who've long been dependent on the timber industry, and where, when that industry was decimated by regulation, Endangered Species Act, improvements.
Can we talk about timber industry at some point too? Sorry.
No, that's where we are now. It's like,
okay,
technological development, etc. For all these reasons, the industry's been decimated. And some people like to demonize the spotted owl or demonize corporations, but the reality is the jobs are gone. And I would argue that another piece of the reality is those jobs in that industry are not coming back in the near future because of federal political reasons, state policy reasons, etc. And what I think, I don't think that a single statewide figure of either party has offered a compelling solution for what comes next for those communities. What are we going to do 30, 40 years later, where some of these places still have unemployment rates of 20, 30, upwards of 40%. And the state, the federal government has never said, here's what our economic replacement for your lost jobs is. And so I think that's where the resentment, the anger, the frustration comes out. And I think it manifests itself sometimes in what I would describe as racism or homophobia. But I think a lot of times the root of it is economic insecurity that leads to fear. So I guess, you're running for the most powerful position in Oregon, where you could really shift the dynamic in some of these communities. What's your answer for rural Oregon, and particularly communities who've just been decimated over the last 30, 40 years? What are you going to do for them?
So Ben, I really appreciate your framing of it, and I want to change a couple of words in there in order to agree with it, which is that you said that the timber industry was decimated. I want to say that in my view, rural communities that were dependent upon timber jobs were decimated, because the industry itself, it didn't skip a beat. It just transferred over through technological and creativity. It switched over to private timberland. So if you look at the number of board feet that were cut year by year, the changes are dramatic in the percent that comes from state land, federal land, and private land. But the shift, the overall number of board feet of timber kept going throughout that whole time. But at the same time, as you were alluding to, the technology of it dramatically decreased the number of jobs that were in the woods and in the mills. And honestly, it's awful. And the federal government did not do what was right, and the state government did not do what was right. But I also want to say that jobs that were gone were very dangerous jobs. So technology yielded safety for the people who were on the job. It also meant that every person was producing a lot more. But that still means that timber communities were decimated, and continue that legacy. We have that now. And whenever I have the opportunity to talk with people at the state level or in our own community doing economic development, I say one thing to them. I'm like, if you just hear one thing, I want you to hear this one thing, which is that when we get out of the pandemic, so we're moving out of it, right? But as we move out of it, we need to remember that in 1990 through 1994, we did not do enough to bring communities, rural communities, with us, to hold them up, to invest in them, to support them, to come out of that. And I feel like so many, you alluded to it, but so many issues in rural communities and in Oregon in general are related to a lack of an investment in people at the time. And so I think about, there's folks in the Philomath area that they had timber, and they had a woods business. They were loggers and haulers, and their family broke apart as a result of no longer having the contracts that they had. It just literally broke apart, and generations of people from there on were scattered to the winds, and who had been in this community forever. And one of the things I feel very strongly is that each community has the right and the duty, perhaps even, to still exist. And that seems weird, but I realize the older I get how important it is to have these communities with unique cultural expressions and histories in their place. But so what we need to do, honestly, as a state and as the leader, we need to go into these communities and figure out the things that are of value right now that we can support, the things that we need to just honestly be like, that's not coming back. And I think you were right in saying that some of these timber jobs, they're just not going to come back. But a lot of communities, so Willamina is a really good example of this. They're Timbertown, USA, like that's what they've called themselves. And I want to say it was 4 years ago, Online Northwest, which is our regional ISP, said, what do you think about us bringing, I think it's like a T1 or a T11 or T4. There's some kind of really high speed, high capacity internet. What do you think about us bringing it to your community? And then for a while, at least, we're going to have low cost internet to you. And they were like, yeah, we will do this. And that's been super helpful to the community as they start to build up a base that's not just reliant upon timber. But the other thing that they really need, this is a result of timber practices over the years. They really need a new water system in order to be able to welcome new people to their community. So there's these abilities. They're really interested in promoting bicycle camping and bike packing. That's like they really want to bring people into the community to do outdoor recreation tourism. Like that's a stated thing. They want to have small homes so that people can afford to live there. So small lot sizes, all of the land use things that allow people to still afford to be in the space and to capitalize on the things that they have, which is they have clean air, they have clean water, and they have really good internet. So there's these possibilities, but they're still held back.
I was going to say, wouldn't it be nice if there was a trail there that you could attract some tourists to use? I'm kidding. Titus, you're up.
So Casey, before we want to transition to politics in just a second, but just one follow up to Ben's question. So, you've talked a lot about rural communities and investment in rural communities. I would say, Democrats have at least held the governorship, for a lot longer than I was even born at this point, whenever Governor Atiyeh had left. And clearly, I think the situation has gotten dramatically worse, at least for rural timber communities over the years. And I don't think that, at least I'm sure Timber Unity would say Governor Brown has done very little basically to help our timber communities kind of either bring back jobs or make a transition or whatever.
Sure.
What are Oregon Democrats just missing about these communities? Like, is it a lack of education investment? Is it a lack of job training? Like, what's missing in the equation that Democrats just haven't put forward yet?
Oh, so you mean to gain the support of rural communities? Is that what you're?
No, I mean in terms of like investment, basically to help. Like your kind of take was like revitalize these communities. Like what is the missing piece to sort of like why that hasn't happened yet?
I mean, I think honestly, Alex, that it requires the going into the community and asking them, and then listening really closely. And even if it doesn't match your conception of the world, figuring out how what you heard can happen in a way that still matches, say, Oregon Democratic values. And I think that goes for urban communities as well as for rural communities, is going and actually listening to them. And I'm going to bring in urban Portland at this point, which is if you listen to people about why they are talking about and trying to recall Ted Wheeler, it's because they feel like he is not listening to his community. And I mean, the same would go for ODOT and the Rose Quarter project, right? Is that Albina Vision Trust and Harriet Tubman and the community that used to exist there is like, you are not listening to us. And they risk disenfranchisement and anger in that community for generations to come.
So I think that's actually, I'm glad you brought in Portland here, because another aspect of the urban rural divide that I think is not spoken about enough is the racial justice component of the urban rural divide. And you alluded to the fact that there's this myth that rural communities are all white, which is certainly not the case. But so we are a show of two white males, and we try to be introspective about that and what that means for the show. You are a straight white male running for governor after the sort of racial justice summer of last year. And so I've got two questions on that. First is, why you? What's the case for what do you uniquely bring to the table that, you know, Tobias Reed and Val Hoyle and Tina Kotek and these sort of Nick Kristof, you know, these other folks don't bring to the table? And acknowledging that every even proposed candidate that I know of that's considering it is a white person in Oregon.
Right.
And then
I have heard about Senator Lou Frederick though, so I'll just put that.
Oh, interesting. That's breaking news for us that Senator Frederick is in the
I just put him in there, so I better go check with him now.
No, that's good. And then the second piece is, I was listening to your interview with Carl Fisher. As a Washington County Democrat myself, I try to be in touch with the good work Carl is doing. And you said something that I found interesting. You said he asked who your base was going to be, and part of your answer was racial equity groups and queer communities who have important issues that we need to address that aren't being addressed in the legislature or the governor's office. So the second part of the question is acknowledging that you're saying part of your base are these diverse communities. What are those issues that you feel like the democratically controlled legislature and the Democratic governor have failed to address since this summer where racial justice was elevated front and center in policymaking?
Right. So that's a great question. I would say that the easiest thing to start with is what the legislature did address. And I would say that the legislature did more on racial equity in policing than we've seen in quite some time. Attempts at police reform, and I will say that I'm happy to be a friend of Representative Ron Nobles, who was instrumental in that. Right, he made it bipartisan, a lot of that, and I'm definitely proud that he stepped up in that way. It shows that people can really learn new things and still hold that kernel and perspective and that experience that they have. He's always like, well, I'm not a Black woman in Portland, but I hear what they're saying. And for me, having the opportunity to hold all these different roles in life, from the being in the sewer, fixing the steam pipes, and being up on the surface, walking with the privileged college students. I hear people, and then I do my damnedest to figure out how to take their concerns and find a solution that works within the systems that we have. And I just take that into everything I do. What I will say is that while some progress was made on policing reform, there's so much more that can happen. And I'll point to, as an example, the alternatives to police response forces, right? So like the Cahoots model, or I think they're calling it Portland Street Response. In our community, it's the CARES Alliance, and which is a much more comprehensive approach to it.
And basically, for listeners, it's when an unarmed person who specializes in mental health shows up to certain police calls rather than a police officer, right? That's what you're referring to?
Yes, exactly. So only $5 million was set up for that project statewide. And I will say that the legislature knows that that's not really enough to even get one up and running, but it's an attempt to address this situation of reimagining public safety as defined by the community. And I think that's a really important part of it, is that Portland should have a different response to racial inequity in policing than Lake County, just by their nature of being different places. Even if they have the same problem, they should have different responses. And I think the legislature providing that funding and the opportunity can do that. But there's also more to injustice in the policing system, because if we're just talking about policing, we're not talking about criminal justice reform, right? And criminal justice reform didn't move nearly as far as it should have in this legislative session. And I think that it can move forward in future sessions.
Are you talking about non-unanimous juries, I'm guessing, or are there other components as well?
That is a great one. Yeah. But there's a whole myriad of them. I mean, part of it is pulling out things that really don't need to be in Measure 11, mandatory minimums. Yep. We pulled out juvenile, and then we tried to pull out women who who have histories of domestic violence and are in the carceral system. So that's, all these different ones, trying to invest in people as they're coming out of the system so that they can be awesome, fully functioning, satisfying, meaningful parts of our society when they come out. Because it is like 98% of people who come into DOC, Department of Corrections, come out of DOC.
Mm-hmm.
And we really don't need them going back in and harming our community in the meantime. So there are many ways that we can reduce the harms that are done to communities and communities of color and to victims by reducing the overall footprint of our criminal justice system while still keeping people safe. And that's like the fundamentals of communities of color challenge to the criminal justice system is we can do better for people by reducing how many people are in the system and still keep people safe.
So, Casey,
another way. So, non-unanimous juries are one way to think about how to address it, so that's not just the AG's responsibility, is to really take it at the governor, the executive leadership in the state, like the statewide office holders, the legislature, and the AG together, and actually consider something along the lines of a truth and reconciliation, where we actually look at, because a lot of the people who were convicted by non-unanimous juries are likely did commit the crime. So it would be injustice to let them go, but it would also be terribly expensive to try everybody over again too.
So real quickly before Alex goes, there's the Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum is getting hammered from a lot of national groups saying you should apply this Supreme Court decision that nullifies non-unanimous juries for retroactively for past cases. Do you think she should do that and apply that standard retroactively?
I think other people think that she can do that. I think a better solution would actually be to form essentially a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that we have a system set up to address a lot of other harms that have happened through the criminal justice system and process. And that would be simply one of them, is to relook at certain cases. But it would be a whole of government approach, right? So it wouldn't be the AG bowing to pressure from one group. It would be all of us together really looking at what is the right thing going forward for people in our state, both for the people who are incarcerated unjustly and for the people who were convicted by a non-unanimous jury but likely actually committed crimes. And then from there, honestly, I think I see this as a model where we can do things like address a history of incarcerating people for drug offenses, and then really look at that and what it looks like to have some level of reparations for communities. So for example, right now we have cannabis has been legal now for 5 years under a regulated system, but people of color still struggle. They struggle to get the capital to start up businesses within the cannabis system. Whereas all I had to do was fill out the paperwork, put up a fence, and put up cameras, and I was in business. I didn't have to worry about the fact that I had a criminal record and I had no access to capital. So I do think that if we address non-unanimous juries, we also have the opportunity to address a lot of other issues of injustice in the community. I mean, for that matter, we probably should be thinking as a state about whether, a couple of years ago, there was sonar that was used at Chamawa Indian School.
Right.
And it found that there were graves, there were likely skeletons under the surface in certain areas. Addressing that is something that we need to do. Honestly, I feel like for our collective psyche as a state, is to address some of these issues of injustice before they become something that carries with us as a scar and a stain on the state. And so that actually goes back to the timber wars and timber industries and timber communities being decimated, because some of these things we just haven't addressed.
Thank you for that answer.
Yeah. So Casey, we're getting into the question that everybody wants to hear. Okay. So we have a New York Times columnist with global renown who's probably going to enter the race. We have the Speaker of the Oregon House. We have potentially the Secretary of State, potentially the Attorney General. potentially the treasurer, potentially the mayor of Portland, and potentially the chairwoman of the Multnomah County Commissioners. Okay?
And the labor commissioner.
And the labor commissioner also.
Oh, and SEIU's executive
Melissa
director.
Unger, right?
Oh, yeah, and Melissa Unger.
And maybe Lou Frederick. We don't know.
and maybe Senator Frederick. So give us the political pitch of saying, okay, I'm going up against all of these big guys and big gals who are statewide office, et cetera. What is your strategy basically to win the primary? And I see it in some way. Maybe you're going to take the Donald Trump route, right? You're sort of coming out of nowhere, make a big name for yourself. You only have to win like 35% of the primary to be able to pull it out. So give us the political case for Casey for governor.
Well, I would say, Alex, that I have never been, and I never will be, the person who shocks somebody with the statements I make. And people are like, well, so I would say that politically connected people are like, well, you just have to shock people and say outrageous things. And I'm like, that's not actually me. And everybody needs to be true to themselves, especially as an elected official and as a person who's campaigning. I feel like the best thing we can do for people in Oregon is to be true to ourselves. And for me, I mean, the pitch to the community is, do you want to have somebody that'll bring people together who absolutely loves people across the state of Oregon and that you're excited and proud to have as your governor? Because I see the governor position as the person who really is the mourner, the cheerleader, the person who gets excited about every single part of Oregon and is willing to just knuckle down and persist on these like really intractable problems and is willing to address them. So that's how I see my role in the state of Oregon right now, is just getting people so damn excited to like take those stickers off of their car that said my governor is an idiot. Right? Be like, all right, we're past that now. We're in a time when it's okay to disagree with one another, right? Like Ben and Alex, presumably you disagree. So far we haven't really today, but like presumably you disagree. And I really want us to get to a spot where it's like, yes, that's the start of finding a solution.
Well,
that wasn't a very good pitch, but that's me.
No. I think that was a fine pitch, and I regret that we are at the hour mark in our interview, where we could have really dove into the disagreements with Alex and myself and you. But Casey,
we're this close,
so close. Like, oh, we should talk about let's see, death penalty, involuntary servitude, maybe public options,
abortion for sure,
abortion.
But yeah, we'll save that for
guns.
When you win the primary, we're having you back and we're going to tackle the hard-hitting issues.
That sounds great.
But Casey, thank you again for taking the time. And then the last thing we like to do before we close is, if someone heard this interview and they want to get involved in your campaign or they want to learn more about you, what's the best way for someone to be connected or to learn more?
Yeah, so the simple repository for most information is kullafororegon.com, and that'll be a place where you can buy campaign merchandise, you can donate, you can tell me how awful I am, or you can send me an email from there. Go there. I'm on Twitter a lot because it's really fun and people are really nice to me there.
I've never heard anybody say that about Twitter.
I know, right? This is my life, is when people consistently underestimate me and then they're like, that's weird. Thank you, Alex.
You heard it from Casey. To make friends, go to Twitter. Very easy place to get along. But Casey, thanks again. And for our listeners, thanks for listening to another episode. Don't forget to hit subscribe and to give us a 5-star rating. And we will see you next week with another episode. Thanks, Casey.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks, Alex.